Welcome, everyone. Today, we're going to be talking about Orlando Anderson and the four acts. Now, Orlando Anderson, for those of you who don't know, is a Jamaican American. He's a black man, a professor of sociology at Harvard. He's currently 85 years old, so he's still alive. He's most known for his work, Slavery and Social Death, which was published in 1982. The book we're going to be looking at today is called The Ordeal of Integration, Progress and Resentment in America's Racial Crisis. This book was published in 1997. Orlando Anderson is really good to read because he isn't fully on one side or the other. He's not full conservative, he's not a full liberal. And there's a part in the book, I want to read it to you, that kind of explains why I picked this book up and read it. So Orlando Anderson writes, this is on page 11, I have given up trying to explain to semi-literate American magazine editors and sound-bitten television producers why it is laughable to categorize me as a conservative. For the same reason I long gave up attempting to explain to angry bourgeoisie Jamaicans that I have never been a pro-Castro communist. Essentially, he's being attacked by both sides. Some people think he's a communist. Other people think that he's a conservative. And that is a good way to be perceived in the public if you're going to be a professor, because at least in that way, people don't, you can receive and give information that's on both sides. Okay. In the part of this book, especially in the beginning part of the book, he's really critiquing a lot of leftist ideas. And he's critiquing a whole lot of leftist claims about the family structure and why blacks don't do as well and all that sort of stuff. And then there becomes a turn in the book. This particular chapter begins that turn. It's called The Moral Crisis of Conservative Racial Advocacy. This is where he takes on some of the black commentators. He doesn't mention them by name, but he mentions a whole lot of their claims. And from there, he starts taking on some of the more quote-unquote right-wing ideas. One of the following ones is race and IQ, which is some of the things that he talks a lot about, which of course I don't really discuss race and IQ here, but it's an interesting subject. So in this particular chapter, Orlando Anderson proposes what I refer to as the four acts. There's the acts of man, the acts of God, the acts of degradation, and the acts of history. And Orlando Anderson makes the argument that the government should get involved and at some point intervene in every single one of those acts. The problem with that is once you take that into account, the government is in every element of your life. And it is almost like he backed himself into a communist ideal. But before we get into the acts, though, I do want to look at the opening sentence from this chapter, because I think this typifies what a lot of conservatives and a lot of liberals and how they feel. But they don't really understand what it means when they start breaking down the things that they want the government to do. So the opening sentence to this thing, how can we promote autonomy and self-determination without falling prey to selfishness and the abandonment of those in need? It's a good question, and it's the question that we all teeter upon. At what point have you crossed over into from being a person who can be self-determined to being a person who is in need? And then when do we stop intervening in your life once you have reached a certain point? Well, this is where we get into the four acts, because he doesn't really explain that answer as much as he decides that as a individual who has been labeled a conservative but doesn't really view himself as one, he doesn't believe that the government should be involved in everything. But he does believe that there are times and instances where government intervention is correct. This is something that many people agree with. So he lays out the four acts, and I'm going to lay them out here for you now. So the overall, before we get into the four acts, the overall is that the individual, meaning me or you, can only do so much. And then the four acts occur. These are the acts of man. These are things that are man-made problems, issues that you or I may have individually. Then there's acts of God, which are things that you or I have in common that happen that are beyond our control. Then there's the acts of degradation, which are a chain of consequences that affect everybody in society. So again, it goes from you to me and you together to me and you together again. And then there's the acts of history, which is our shared history that may affect how we live today. And it's that act of history that is a real problem, because obviously it gets into reparations. Spoiler alert, it gets into reparations. Before we get there, though, I want to lay out what Orlando Anderson, how he thinks about this subject. So his overall critique of conservatives is that they miss the importance of collective action and collective agency. And he uses Margaret Thatcher, the former Prime Minister of England, who said there's no such thing as society, which is one of those Ayn Rand type of ideologies. And he basically is arguing against that society exists and that we have a responsibility to each other to make sure that our society is doing well for everyone. And he writes on page 114, not only do human beings act responsibly and morally as individuals, they act jointly as collective agents. The family is such an agent. The community is another. The state or government is yet another. Nor is such agency confined to non-formal and non-economic activities. Collective agency is an essential part of the capitalist system. The most important example of such agency is the firm, that organizational foundation of capitalism. So he wants people to see everything like a corporation. Basically, you live and operate in a corporation. This is how he's going to appeal to conservatives, by appealing to them economically. He later on says, page 115, he says, people in their roles as corporate or representative agents are expected to behave differently in their relations with people from the way they behave as individuals in relation with the same people. Basically, as a member of a corporation, you behave differently as a member of that corporation than you do as an individual. And this is what he means when he's going to talk about a little bit later about racial representatives. Okay, there is these people who represent blacks in general, how they view blacks in general versus how they individually want to be perceived and seen. He continues on page 116. The fundamental flaw in conservative thinking is the refusal to acknowledge the peculiar demands of representational behavior and collective life. Later, he says, conservatives more than any other group are prone to appeal to collective ideas and agency when it suits them. Later, he says, one of the great moral and intellectual failures of neoclassical economics is its grudging acknowledgement and general neglect of collective problems. So he's right in so much that conservatives do appeal to the collective when they want to do certain things. A good modern example is immigration reform. Donald Trump wants to do immigration reform, so he's using collective action, the power of the government, to enforce immigration law. He's also doing it with tariffs. This is also why so many libertarians and a lot of right-wingers are bristling at what Trump is doing. Because, yes, we understand that the United States of America exists, but we don't necessarily like the idea of masked men in the streets, snatching people from their homes, and generally creating terror. We don't necessarily like that, even though I do believe that a lot of that is TV media propaganda. So he continues, allowing him to lay out his argument. He says, even if the conservative representative rejects the notion of collective agency and insists that only individuals are agents, he is still required to acknowledge one important aspect of individual agency that is not normally and should not be for reasons of practical judgment invoked in face-to-face interactions. This is the fact that individual agency is itself profoundly social or collective. He later says representative agents' main role is to consider all those areas directly impinging on individual lives over which the individual has limited or no control. Those constraints, that inhibit the exercise of agency. So basically, there are things that are in the way of you doing what you want to do or acting in a certain way in the world. And this is where we get into the 4 acts. There are acts of man that prevent you and provide constraints upon you. There are acts of God that prevent you and act upon you. There are acts of degradation that act upon you. And then there's acts of history that act upon you. So when it comes to government intervention, he actually skips acts of man and goes straight to acts of God. And he says that if you see a moral obligation to get involved with acts of God, then you should see a moral obligation to get involved with acts of man. Because God works in mysterious ways, but we know what man is doing. And for those of you who are trying to figure this thing out, acts of man are individual decisions that are made, or it might be made even by the government, that affects you as an individual. Or an act of God is something that happens to you that you had no control over. A good act of God would be hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, stuff like that. This is something that even Ayn Rand, who is a radical individualist, has said, okay, the government should be involved when it comes to disasters, when it comes to emergencies. The government should be involved. She wants hands off the economy 99% of the time. But when there is this disaster, she's saying that you should put what you believe or put yourself to the side and actively help other people. And Orlando Patterson, is saying you're absolutely right, but that should also apply to acts of man. But what are acts of man? Well, acts of man, as he puts it, are things like the government transforming our economy from primarily manufacturing to a tech and service-based economy. So we should have some kind of government intervention when it comes to the changing of the economy. And this was written again in 1997, and we see that the government did get involved, and that caused even more trouble because this was indeed caused by the government. NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreements with Canada and Mexico, and these things would come later on a global level. The globalist agenda stripped America of manufacturing and pushed us all into the service industry and the tech industry. So when you think about something like an act of man, that the government is what is impoverishing certain people, that there should be some kind of collective action towards that. And there's been a lot of discussion about how best to do that. One of the things that has been lobbied about is the universal basic income, that we should just give people money just for existing because, well, the government screwed you by getting rid of manufacturing. And we've seen conservatives, people like Tucker Carlson, which I will put into the conservative camp for now, who has said that we should ban things like self-driving trucks. Because if you have self-driving trucks, then a large percentage of our economy are men who are providing for their families with driving trucks. So if we get rid of self-driving trucks, those men could keep their jobs. But if we allow AI and computers to drive trucks across country, we don't need men anymore. Therefore, we've devastated these men's families. This would be a good example of an act of man. But this is widespread government intervention into the economy, and it will require vast wealth redistribution, which is socialism. Now, again, earlier we talked about it when he says that he didn't want people to think that he was some kind of pro-Castro communist. Well, if you feel that we have to get involved with an ever-changing economy and that it is our responsibility, our moral responsibility, to provide for people who have lost jobs, whether through unemployment benefits, which should be temporary, so that you can get from one job to another. But if we go to the point where now these people can't find jobs at all, we should just take care of them. All right, so where does that end? Is that just income? Or is that also, do we have to provide housing? Do we have to also provide health insurance? And at that point, we're in a socialist economy. We're just doing massive wealth redistribution from the people who made it to the people who can't adapt. These are very different from acts of God. Now, in an act of God, where there's a flood like Hurricane Katrina, or the various hurricanes or snowstorms or whatever, these things come and go. You know, they come in, they devastate, but the storm eventually ends. You know, the flood eventually recedes, and we can now move in and begin some sort of collective action on that area. But does that mean that all of a sudden now we are responsible for rebuilding people's homes? Are we, because some people think so. That would be the socialist response, is that, you know, now through government intervention, we're giving people money to fix their properties and or to move, which is, you know, some of the things that happened with Hurricane Katrina and with other recent tornadoes and hurricanes and such, is that we give people money to fix up their homes, to fix the damage, and all these sorts of things. Unfortunately, what we found out in 2024 is that FEMA, the government agency that is responsible for helping individuals after an act of God, which in this case was a hurricane, was engaging in political discrimination. So we all were supposed to come together because we have a moral obligation to help people who are victims of tornadoes and hurricanes. And then the government decided we're going to pick and choose which people we're going to help based off their political beliefs or their racial background or whatever. And at that point, what are we paying for? We can't trust the government to intervene when it comes to an act of God. We certainly can't expect them to intervene fairly when it comes to an act of man or an act of degradation or to an act of history. And that's one of the fundamental problems here, outside of it being socialistic, is that the government does not behave in a perfectly moral way. No matter what argument you want to make, the government is not a moral institution. It is an institution of power. And it's supposed to be an institution that you utilize the collective will of the population to enact justice, you know, to be fair. You know, it can't be perfectly equal, but it can be a fair institution. When the government is infested with individuals who believe in privilege plus power, meaning that they can now use privilege in their power structure, the system fails because their bias is now going to be against people who are also in the collective. What then is the incentive for individuals to stay in the collective if the collective is going to be working against them? This is the same problem with the acts of man. You're going to redistribute wealth from people who built it to people who didn't. So basically, you're going to utilize collective power to then section off a piece of the collective who are going to benefit for an indeterminate amount of time, probably forevermore, because this is what the government wants to do. They have decided that these people need help and you don't. And that's not the way that the government should function. The government should not function by splitting the population into people who receive benefits and those who have to pay for other people's benefits. Now let's move on to the acts of degradation. I'm going to read this one verbatim from the book. This is from page 119. Acts of degradation to the social and cultural environment, chronic poverty and unemployment, overcrowded, ethnically segregated or rural ghettos, and drug-infested, crime-ridden streets all create a chain of degradation with dire consequences for all members of the society. Whole regions of the nation's economy may be threatened by this degradation, in exactly the same way that a minority of polluters may threaten whole industries. This makes a whole lot of sense when you take into account the hood. You know, I've lived in the hood my whole life. and there's, broken windows policing, where you say, hey, when you go into a neighborhood, if there's graffiti, unchecked, abandoned buildings, things don't look clean, they don't look safe. And if you don't fix those things up, what you will see is a snowballing of that same effect everywhere. You'll soon see, if you see garbage on the streets, loose weave, uh, all that sort of stuff. Eventually, it just continues to accumulate because people won't clean it up because they don't think it's their responsibility. So he's saying it is our responsibility, it's our collective responsibility to keep things orderly and safe, which makes sense until you really put some thought into it. There are certain things, widespread poverty, widespread unemployment, those things are indeed a problem. But those things can be fixed by allowing other individuals to step in and fix those problems. There's always people who are looking to start businesses. There's always people who are looking to do something about the disrepair of their neighborhoods, and they're often stopped by the government. They're stopped by some kind of government regulation, or they're stopped by, activists who are lobbying the government. And so what you end up with is situations where something that does degrade the population is allowed to go on because the government doesn't want to step in. So massive theft in places like California, which of course hurts businesses, and the businesses leave, and now you have an increase in unemployment. He will probably file that under an active man, that these companies are pulling their roots from these states and leaving. But what he's not seeing is that a lot of it is the government doing this. The government not punishing thieves is allowing people to steal, and that's affecting business. So it's not just unemployment and poverty and homelessness and stuff like this. But we also need to take into account that even if we are talking about something like, let's say, homelessness, how much money does California spend on homelessness? Billions and billions of dollars, 10 billion or something like that. And that money just vanishes. And the homeless population is still there and growing. If it's our moral responsibility to fix this degradation, then we are also morally responsible for making sure that the result is achieved. And the results are not being achieved in many places, especially when we're looking at places like California and Oregon and Seattle and Washington and Washington, D.C. and some other places. You're seeing widespread homelessness because you're seeing an industry of non-governmental organizations, otherwise known as NGOs, who are being paid to deal with the homelessness problem. And this is, again, us collectively saying homelessness is a problem and that we can't have homeless people dying in the streets. We cannot have homeless people sleeping on the bus stops, sleeping on the bus, sleeping on the trains. This stuff is bad for our economy. It's bad for our population. It's bad to have, schizophrenics walking the street, drug addicts and such. But the government doesn't know how to fix this problem. How can the government fix the problem? You look at California again. How does the government fix the problem of fentanyl and heroin addicts in the street? Well, they decided we're going to give people free heroin, and therefore they'll be safe. They won't overdose. That doesn't fix the problem. That just continues the problem in a safer way. There was also, I forget where, but there was another program where they were giving alcoholics free alcohol. They were giving them alcohol shots. And that doesn't fix the problem. And then you also take into account that when you use the word pollution, now for some people, they will agree. You can't have, the cartoon villains dumping sludge in our water or pumping horrible stuff into our air. That's absolutely an issue that we need to take into account. But where do we put the line on that? Because climate change and climate activists, they have decided that in certain places they want to have gas taxes where you have to pay more money to drive your personal vehicle. There's mileage taxes, which I believe was something was being pitched in, is it Massachusetts or Connecticut or something like that. They're banning gas vehicles, which are cars. They're banning gas ovens. They want to ban large farms because they say, well, animals produce way too much CO2. And eventually, you get to the point where this ability to fight pollution, to protect our collective air and collective water, is being weaponized to, again, attack certain individuals and to push left-wing concepts like community transportation. We want to push buses and trains, so we need to ban cars. We want to push electronic vehicles, so we want to ban gas cars. And this doesn't seem like it actually helps anyone, especially considering climate science is something that most people don't understand and people still disagree about it. So why should we have widespread government intervention in things like pollution? And where do we stop it? Where do we say enough's enough when it comes to the pollution? Okay, you want to get rid of plastic bags? And now people are, okay, you don't, no plastic bags. Okay, fine. No plastic or limiting plastic. Okay, maybe we can get away with that. But we've gone way beyond that since this book was written. This book was, again, written in 1997. Since then, we have been introduced to paper straws. Okay, people are in California and other places are being told you can't have a plastic straw. Is there no limit to this? And then you also take into account, again, the homelessness crisis or the poverty crisis. Look at what's going on in New York, where now you have the Zohran Mamdani administration that are seizing property through rent stabilization and other forms of manipulation of capital. And they're deciding we're going to side with the renters over the landlords, which sounds good on paper if you are that kind of person. But then you have to realize who is responsible for the property. Well, it's the landlord. If the landlord is responsible for the property and the landlord is the person who is supposed to keep the property up, then are they going to do that for free? Well, no. Well, they're going to get paid something. Okay, but they're going to spend more to keep up the property than they're going to get in return. Why should they engage in that investment? Well, that's their problem. They should just sell their building to the government. Okay, at that point, you're creating more ghettos because that's what the ghetto was. Wasn't I grew up with people constantly complaining about housing projects. And now what we're hearing is there needs to be more housing projects. The projects where I came from was the poorest part of the city because the state is not a good landlord. The state does not care if your walls are paper thin and if the buildings are falling apart. This is why the Cabrini Green in Chicago was torn down. It was unlivable for years before it was finally torn down. And also, what you do is you end up segregating the poorest people in your city to this rent stabilized or rent controlled area, or this area with no rent at all, where the government is the landlord, and they don't appreciate it. They tear it up. And because these people tend to be the lowest IQ of those of the population, because people who can take care of themselves tend to do so. So you push your lowest IQ people into a packed space, and then they interact with each other all day with virtually no income and virtually no opportunities to make it out of there. What are they going to do except use each other for entertainment, which is either massive reproduction, with having more children than they really need, which of course boosts our welfare problem, and they engage in crime. So you've created a whole new situation that we've already been dealing with, just in a different part of town. This is the problem with welfare and housing policy in the United States. We want to basically coddle people and never force them to actually take care of themselves. Now, it makes sense, if you're sitting down thinking about it and saying, there are things that are going on in our neighborhoods that we need to collectively come together and fix. And one of those things is poverty One of those things is unemployment. One of those things is homelessness. One of those things is, the criminal justice system and all of that sort of stuff. It's like, okay, great. But the free market can fix those things. We don't need to do that as a collective, quote unquote. There is nothing wrong with individuals moving into these areas and providing stable housing or providing jobs on their own without government intervention. And part of our problem that these acts of degradation exist is because the government has decided they're going to favor certain people and certain sections of society over others. And a lot of this happens because of the other acts, either acts of God or acts of man, right? So in Michigan, there's a whole lot of government influence from the auto industry. This also includes unions, right? So there's an outsized power structure from the unions and the companies, and they're pushing against certain competition. They're getting favorable tax codes and all this sort of stuff. And it doesn't really benefit the rest of the state to take care of this one industry against all the other possible industries that could exist in the state. Also, when we talk about acts of degradation, what does that also include people with disease? Does this also include like HIV? Does it include people with diabetes? Does it include COVID? Does it include alcoholics? Does it include heroin addicts? Where's the limit on this is your responsibility as a person? This is not our responsibility as a society. Is it my responsibility as a person who is not an alcoholic to take care of a person who is an alcoholic? No. Is it our collective issue here? No, it might be the collective when it comes to the family, this individual's family. And by illness, I also mean mental illness, which is another big issue here. We're now supposed to take care of people and don't know anything about them. And we also can't have any real control over them either. For instance, the mentally ill, you have to get a court order in order to get them to take medication. They still have individual rights in this collective situation here. But the individual rights of other people are going to be violated to uphold the individual right of this person. For instance, the individual right of a innocent individual sitting on a train is violated when a mentally ill person that people know is mentally ill is allowed to get on the train and assault them or kill them in some instances. Well, did we do our collectively moral, responsible job to get this mentally ill person off the street? No, we didn't. We allowed this person to matriculate back into the community, and they did great deals of damage to other people. And this happens all day, every day. We don't always enforce this collective responsibility, and then when we do, the person we're acting against is seen as a victim. This is also where we come to criminal behavior. It is our collective responsibility to make sure our streets are clear of crime. But if we do that, then we have left-wing judges and left-wing prosecutors who decide that the individual rights of the criminal is more important than the collective obligation of the society to be free of fraudsters or murderers or whatever, right? They selectively utilize the law. Certain people are allowed to get away with assaults, theft, weapons charges, making threats, all this sort of stuff. They get to go right back out on the street where there's a certain section of the population where their lives are completely destroyed because they said something in public that the collective, quote unquote, disagrees with. You can't operate in that system. It just does not work. It doesn't work. You have to have a government that functions fairly. So I agree. There are collective problems. I do think that some of the more extreme libertarians, some people who are nearer to Ayn Rand, they would completely disagree with collective problems, but I do think that we have collective problems. And I don't disagree that all the things that he mentioned are collective problems. I disagree with how we're going to fix these problems as a collective when you have an incompetent government. So that gets us to the last act, which is the acts of history. So when we talk about acts of history, we move to page 122 of his book. And he says, the conservatives object to such a policy on the grounds that collective agency and liability do not exist. It's sheer hypocrisy and self-contradiction. Collective reparation is a well-established principle in the laws of nations. And then he says he uses antitrust law as a good example of a law of history. And he talks about the breaking up of AT&T and said that AT&T committed no specific injury against any small communications firm, but, quote, acts of history that were injurious to the growth of competitors, and that these accumulated acts of history had created an environment in which it was nearly impossible for any other firm to fairly compete. And says that antitrust lawsuits were brought by affirmative action for small firms to get themselves a piece of the pie. And he says, all I'm asking of the representative agents concerned with the plight of Afro-Americans is that they treat their collectively generated problems with the same compassion they bestow on corporate actors injured by similar collectively induced constraints on their freedoms to act. And then he so we're talking about reparations, right? That slavery was one of the things that prevented the competition of Black Americans, and we should collectively pay back slavery. Now, this is at the very end of the chapter, but it's nestled in there. Now, there is no doubt that slavery, Jim Crow laws, and years of discrimination adversely affected Black Americans. The question that I have is, why are we starting there when it comes to history? History has always existed. So where does history begin? Does history begin in 1619? Well, that's very fortuitous for Black Americans, because now we don't have to deal with the fact that they were slaves in Africa. If history begins 2 weeks ago, then there weren't any slaves. So where are we going to begin with dealing with these acts of history? And then to what end? When did history stop? When did history stop having an effect on us? If history can continuously have an effect, then the history from 1619 is still affecting us today. Then therefore, does that mean that my father had no effect on my lifestyle? His father had no effect? How far back are we going here? Are we saying that people could not overcome these effects of history? Also, another big question here is, does this apply to everyone? Does this apply to everyone who has ever been a slave anywhere on planet Earth? Because even in his book, Slavery and Social Death, he admits slavery existed all over the world. So when do we begin the conversation of certain people should get certain reparations for things that happen in history? And then it's very fortuitous that we decide that we define history in a certain time and place for the benefit of one particular group. Again, why not for other groups? Why not Native Americans? Should they get reparations? And some people will say, well, they did. Well, they also had treaties that the government broke. So that's a fair argument to have, is the government recognize certain rights and privileges that you have as non-citizens or whatever, and then they violated those rights. That's a completely different thing. But are we constantly going to be giving reparations back to these people? For instance, there's this big conversation about what's going on in terms of immigration in the southwestern United States. Mexico, New Mexico, Arizona, California, where all these Mexicans are moving into these areas, and they say, well, this is our land anyway. This all used to be part of Mexico, which is technically true. but they lost a big war and they lost all of that land. Are they now morally allowed to take the land back? That doesn't make sense. What about, did the French get to come back and take back Louisiana because at one point it was theirs? Well, no, they sold it to us. It's our land now. You know, where does this end? Even if we don't talk about black people, because we can't make a policy specifically catered around one specific group of people and their problems, we have to set a principle. And the principle should be that if the government violates your rights as a citizen, you should get something back from that. And the government does this all the time. They do violate people's rights all the time. People get shot by the police unjustly. People have had their homes and properties taken away in eminent domain. People have been forced into prisons with faulty trials. This stuff happens quite regularly. And the government has that reparations that you sue us for something we did wrong, we give you money. Okay, fine. But that's not slavery. Slavery doesn't fit that category because slavery was legal. Not just slavery was legal, but slavery existed everywhere. So even if you weren't a slave in the United States, you would have been a slave in Africa. Or you would have been a slave in South America. Or you would have been a slave in the Caribbean. You would have been a slave anywhere if you were of African descent because they were engaging in slavery. You would have been a slave in North Africa. The likelihood that every single person walking around today does not have slave ancestors is very, very minimal. Pretty much everybody has a slave ancestor because that's how prominent slavery was in human history. If there was a specific type of or category of injurious acts acted upon you by the government, you're Japanese, World War II happens, all of a sudden the government says, for no apparent reason other than the fact that you're Japanese, that you're a traitor, and they throw you in a concentration camp, violating all of your rights, you absolutely have a right to reparations. But the fact that anybody could have been a slave at any point in time in history, and then say, well, you deserve reparations because you were a slave, I don't think so. Because at least at that point in time, that could have been anybody. The idea that white people couldn't have been slaves is wrong. It's false. White people were slaves in the United States. They were also enslaved by Native Americans too. And this is another thing that I find to be quite hypocritical when people talk about reparations, because Native Americans don't have any money. They're poor collectively as a group. But there is an entire body of literature out there about white women who were taken as the spoils of war and forced to join Native American tribes. No, to my knowledge, nobody has ever argued that those Native Americans violated the rights of those citizens and they should have to pay reparations. Nobody made that argument. In fact, the argument is usually, and I looked this up recently, that those white women, when given the opportunity to leave those tribes, they wanted to stay. So you're led to believe that when a Native American man invaded a village or a town or a camp, killed the men, took the women, enslaved the women, impregnated the women, and then the women had an opportunity to go back. They decided, no, I want to stay. Simply because they're white, they're given the agency to agree to being enslaved. But when it comes to slavery, and you may say that a black woman wanted to engage in sex with her master, she could not do that because she was a slave. So what's the difference between those two arguments? Well, those two arguments is, one is a white woman, so we allow her to have agency. Meanwhile, the black woman is not allowed to have agency. That's not correct. I thought they were equals. If they were equals, and then acts of history says both of them were enslaved at some point in time, taken from their native population, forced into a new population, their entire concept of who they were was changed. These women who were kidnapped by Native Americans, most of the time they took new names. They had children with these Native American populations. They were, we call it now, brainwashed, but it's okay. That's why you never hear about it. Never hear about it. But you never stop hearing about the black women who were enslaved by whites and had children with them. And then, of course, they're called bedwenches if they didn't want to leave. It doesn't seem appropriate to me that when we talk about acts of history that we are in any way being specific to black Americans. We should be talking about all people who have been enslaved or abused or discriminated against in history. Now, let's say you don't want to talk about slavery. Let's say, okay, slavery is a fact of human history. There were slaves everywhere. Can't talk about that. Let's talk specifically then about things like discrimination, Jim Crow South. All right, so now you actually have a point. If you want to talk about something like the convict leasing program, where the rights of black Americans were violated by like the state of Georgia or the state of Alabama or the state of Louisiana, where they were picking them up for breaking these flimsy black codes, throwing them in prison, and then they were forced to work on plantations to death and usually dying by dehydration or they were beaten to death. Then you have a reason to make an argument about reparations. And then I will actually be on your side because these people were citizens of the United States with full rights and privileges of citizens of the United States. And they were treated unjustly. That's where the conversation should begin if we want to talk about black people and reparations. The reason we don't start there is because there's not an overall benefit to black Americans. It is a benefit to certain black American families who might have had a father or an uncle or a brother-in-law or somebody like that who was unjustly treated in prison. That's the conversation we should be having. That should be the paperwork that we're going out there getting, is that, you know, your dad got pulled over for vagrancy and he died in prison because he was forced to tar a roof in 100-degree heat with no water, or they beat him to death. That should be the conversation, but not slavery. Slavery is, I'm not going there. Now, when it comes to discrimination, you know, the Jim Crow laws, there was tons of discrimination for other groups, even groups that we now consider to be white. There's tons of discrimination against the Irish and the Italians, most notably for them being Catholic, which is a completely different level of discrimination that we don't get ourselves into. White America did not like Catholics. They never really liked foreigners at all. And just like blacks, they were often forced to live and work in small ghettos and groups on their own. This is why there's a Germantown, little Italian neighborhoods, little Greek neighborhoods, all across places like New York and Philadelphia and Detroit. Because when immigrants came here, they weren't treated fairly. So they created their own little subcultures here where they didn't really need to learn how to speak the language. They could worship in any way that they chose, and they built from there. Blacks had that opportunity as well, and some of them did in the 20th century. They had, Harlem and Detroit and, certain areas of other cities where they were actually able to create middle classes and engage in entrepreneurship and all that sort of stuff. So discrimination in itself is not that injurious because everybody, again, has faced discrimination. My most important point when it comes to acts of history is that you can't fix the past. When you have such collective agency, you talk about the blacks, because now the conversation is about what blacks? Are you talking about the blacks that were born here? Okay, now we have this ADOS FBA definition of black where it doesn't include black immigrants. Okay, fine. I can agree with that. But then what about blacks who were born in states that never had legal slavery? Like myself, I was born in Michigan. There was never legal slavery in Michigan, meaning that when Michigan entered the United States, they did not have slavery. California did not have slavery. Well, when you talk to the activist class, they'll say, well, you inherited the slave guilt when you joined the country where other people were enslaved. That doesn't make sense. Okay? Because It really doesn't make sense. Their whole idea is if you benefit from slavery, then you are guilty of slavery, but everybody benefited from slavery. The fact that this country exists is because of slavery. Now, it didn't grow our economy, which I'm going to talk about in a different video at some other time. But there were black slave owners. There were Native American slave owners. Again, anybody could be a slave owner in the United States. So the idea that if you benefited from slavery, then you're guilty of slavery. Okay, that also includes black people because black people benefited from slavery. It might not have been a large number of black people, but it also was not a large number of white people that benefited from slavery. My point here is that history is far more complex than most people would lead you to believe. And you also have to take into account, as most slavery historians do, that wealth is not static. This is a conversation that we end up having literally all the time, is that even if you wanted to have reparations, nobody was owned by the United States government. The governments didn't really own slaves. Now, there were colleges and universities, they may have had slaves. There were some institutions that engaged in slavery. There was a lot of individuals who were engaged in slavery. But the country itself did not own slaves. It was basically just a fact of life that people had property, and property involved other human beings. Now, one of my favorite, obviously a lot of people's favorites, intellectuals is Thomas Sowell. He wrote a book called The Vision of the Anointed in 1995. And he objected to the concept of black people being handicapped due to the legacy of slavery. A lot of people say, oh, he's a coon. Well, that's what they all say, right? And he noted some things, and he talked about this reparations argument and what Orlando Patterson calls acts of history. He called it the quest for cosmic justice. And he wrote a book by that title, but I haven't read it. But in the idea for quest of cosmic justice is an idea where we need to fix the past. We need to right the wrongs of history. And we do that by ignoring current issues and the host of factors that influence modern misfortunes. And this is something that both him and Orlando Anderson can agree on, because despite the fact that Sowell's book was printed 2 years before Patterson's book, the two books that I'm talking about here, they agree on things like teen mothers, teenage girls getting pregnant, unmarried households, for instance. These are things that they agree on. And these are the things that lead mostly to poverty and the misfortune of black America, not slavery. Slavery is not the cause of modern black American problems, because the issues are now also creeping over into the white communities. Well, if we disagree and say white people never had slavery in this country, why is it all of a sudden a bunch of white guys have baby mamas now too? Why is it a bunch of white girls that are now getting pregnant without being married? These sorts of, and they lead to the exact same problems that we have in the black community. Now, Thomas Sowell obviously is brilliant. And one of the things that I really love about his books is that he talks about human beings as basically natural actors. And one of his favorite things is that human beings are limited. We're limited in our knowledge. We're limited in our commitment. And we're limited in our compassion. And when you look at all of the things that Orlando Anderson wants us to do, or wanted us to do in 1997, we were still constrained by the same things way back then. Let's say we wanted to do something, as I mentioned before. We don't know how to do it. We don't have the knowledge to provide for every single person in the United States without end. We can't do that. We just can't do it. And then also understand these people also want an unlimited immigration policy. That even stretches our rationale as human beings. I'm not even talking about resources. I'm just talking about us as people. How do we rationalize that in our minds? How do we take care of everybody? We can't. We just don't have the knowledge to do that without destroying our economy. We have a limit on our commitment. Basically, some people are very, very, very interested in these subjects, but they also know very little about it. So they're very passionate in things like housing policy or welfare policy, and their commitment is going to be greater than the rest of everybody else's commitment. That's why they're activists for it. And their commitment is going to be, in terms of being greater than everybody else's, other people are going to turn on a dime. And a good example of that is what you see with the concept of immigration. Somebody may feel that we should open our doors and have unlimited immigration from all over the world into the United States, stretch our resources way too thin, and cause all of these other problems. And other people are going to say, I agree with that, but at some point, we've gone too far. When most of the city doesn't speak English, we've gone too far. When a large percentage of our resources in terms of school are teaching children English, we're going too far. And then the compassion also becomes a limit, where when we see Somalis making fun of Americans as they fraud you, people's compassion is going to be gone. All right, that's just going to be it. When you feel bad for Palestinians or Arabs or whatever, and all of a sudden they're chanting "Death to America," your compassion is going to be gone at some point, right? And some people don't even have the compassion to get that far. But there's always these limits, and these are human limits. We're not unlimited creatures, and this is what makes what Thomas Sowell says so fucking smart, is because he recognizes that as human beings we can only do so much. He talks about these sacrifices that need to be made if you want to fix problems. Basically, he says, look, there are no solutions to problems. There's only trade-offs. And you have to make a decision about which you care about more. You have to create a hierarchy of things that you care about more, and that's where you put your resources. So while Orlando Anderson is talking about poverty being a collective thing we can work on, some people would say that's an individual problem. If you're poor, that's an individual problem. We have to look at why you're poor, okay? And you need to fix that if you can. If you're chronically mentally ill, or if you're chronically an alcoholic or chronically something else, we have to deal with that on an individual level. But we can't marshal all of our forces towards this system here, because there's so many other things that we need to fix and work on. And he also talked about, and I think this was a big issue when it comes to me tackling what Orlando Patterson is talking about here, is the hand waving of cost. Basically, when leftists want to do something, the amount of money needed to do it is, they don't want to hear it. It's just something that they want to do. They have a moral obligation to do it. So how much it costs to do, especially when it's collective money that they're talking about here, is unlimited. This is how they can do things like spend $10 billion on illegal immigration or housing or something like that, because it's funny money to them. It doesn't matter. And Orlando Patterson falls into that same situation where there's no limit on any of these things. Acts of man, acts of God, acts of degradation, acts of history. That's everything. That's anything that could possibly affect your life. We can't spend unlimited amounts of money on every single thing. So Thomas Sowell also mentions these never-ending moral crusades, basically mission creep. How we start talking about, hey, we have collective water, so we can't have people dumping crap into our water. And we go from that to we have collective air, we can't have people dumping crap into our air, to now you can't have a gas oven because it affects our collective environment somehow. Like, that should not even been on the conversation, but somehow we got there because we capitulated on other things in terms of our environment. So mission kept creeping forward. All of a sudden, we're now responsible. We got to get rid of farms. We have to get rid of our personal cars. Come on. I mean, that's ridiculous. Another thing Thomas Sowell says is that problems exist on a spectrum, which is absolutely true. Just because you're poor today doesn't mean you'll be poor forever. Just because you're unemployed today doesn't mean you'll be unemployed forever. And unemployment in the short term is much better than unemployment in the long term. And we need to take those things into account. How bad is the problem? Is the problem so bad that we do need to engage in massive government collective action? Or is it something that if we just allow our economy to work, we'll eventually work ourselves out of it without having to dump tons of resources in it? Now, there's not too many examples of this because the government loves to dump resources into things. And so he also talks about personal responsibility, which of course is the number one thing when we talk about conservatives. It always comes up. And that behavior and performance and choices, these things matter. Now, Orlando Anderson is talking about things in which rob you of choice and saying that you really can't act effectively as an agent for yourself. Well, we need to have a conversation about how limited these people are and what are we going to require them to do in order for us to stop taking care of them. And that conversation never comes up. It's never a conversation about, hey, we need to help people, but only from here to here. Like unemployment. Unemployment should, let's say 6 months of unemployment. That's it for your entire life. Or you can stay in a rent stabilized apartment, but only for 8 months. And then you have to pay regular rent. Most people will say, okay, that's good, that's fine. But what you end up finding out is that the left will just extend it forever. There's just no limit to it because they don't believe in limits. And then if you ask any kind of responsibility that the people might have or that you might require of them, the left will see that as something that is immoral. You're being a bully. You know, back in the days when you used to have to drug test people before they can get welfare, or drug test them before they can move into an apartment, government subsidized apartment or whatever. They'll talk about how demeaning it was. It's like, well, you're living off the government. You're living off the people. You can't just sit around, get high, and be drunk and living off the people. But they don't want any responsibility for the person that are being helped. They want to give free needles of heroin to people without the people actually having to stop taking heroin at some point. So there is no personal responsibility in these situations. And when you don't have personal responsibility and you don't require these people to be responsible for themselves, then we go back to Orlando Anderson's initial question. How can we promote autonomy and self-determination without falling prey to selfishness and the abandonment of those in need? How can we do that? By forcing people to be responsible for themselves. For not automatically saying, just because you're poor today, you're going to be poor forever. Just because you're homeless today, you're going to be homeless forever. Certain things are permanent. Mental illness, for instance, like severe chronic mental illness is permanent. Okay, we can have a conversation about somebody who's permanently mentally ill. We can have a conversation about somebody who is permanently disabled. We can have conversations about people who were killed. That's a permanent disability, if that you were murdered. But that takes away from some of those acts, because some of those things are not permanent. They're temporary. And if we're going to have programs, those programs need to be temporary, and they need to have something on the back end that says, in order for this to work, it cannot be extended. But you'll never get anything passed that will not be extended, because mission creep exists, and it always exists. The income tax was only supposed to be for the wealthiest people. And then the wealthiest people started to move their money because they're being targeted by the government. And so the government decided, you know what? I think we'll target everybody. So now everybody has to pay income taxes. So you can't have these programs, even though it sounds good on paper. And we still have these leftists today who will say we need to take care of people because they've fallen victim to government manipulation of the markets, tornadoes, other acts of emergencies. Things are just so bad. The acts of degradation, things are just so bad in these neighborhoods and in these populations that the government has to do something, or that they're victims of the legacy of slavery or Jim Crow or discrimination or whatever. These things will always be excuses. All right. But there is no excuse. If you're a functional, fully adult grown person, you should be able to take care of yourself. And we need to have a economy that favors people taking care of themselves. Anything else will just cause us more trouble. Thank you guys for your time. I'll talk to you later. Peace out.